Dear students, propaganda is an act of advocacy. It is a deliberate attempt to use one-sided statements to a mass audience. The aim of propaganda is to convert people to the views of the person who undertakes it. He or she may use many kinds of symbols like words, gestures, flags, images, music, etc. He or she may use various media of communication, oral, printed, pictorial. He or she may use the newspapers, pamphlets, etc. In other countries, radio will also be used. But in India, this is not possible since the central government owns the radio stations. But on several occasions, other countries and other organizations use the radio for purposes of propaganda. For example, with the outbreak of hostilities between Pakistan and Bangladesh, the revolutionaries used their own transmitting station to inform and enthuse the people. Kautilya gives detailed instructions in his Arthashastra on how to keep people loyal to the king and how to influence the opinion of the people in the enemy kingdom. Similarly, Plato and Aristotle in ancient Greece has described the techniques of propaganda. Thus, using a number of techniques to deliberately alter the views of the people is nothing new. It was being done in the most ancient days with the use of the media available at the time. It was during World War I, 1914-1918, that large-scale techniques were used by the nations at war. It became a fine art in the hands of Hitler and Mussolini during the 30s. After World War II, 1939 to 1944, when the hostilities between US and USSR increased, the era of Cold War started by using all kinds of techniques to shatter the morale of the enemy country. It is well known that the Indian National Congress used many songs during the period from 1920 to 1947 to rouse the masses to fight the British imperialism. Music is a very powerful source of rousing people. This is how the song Vande Mataram became the battle cry throughout the country. The sentiments in favor of patriotism were roused by the use of the image Mathrubhumi. Later on, songs were composed to rouse the people in favor of the formation of linguistic states through songs composed on Mathrubhasha. Propaganda techniques. Let us now look at a brief description of the techniques that have been used in propaganda. Repetition. An impression becomes more permanent and influential with repetition. The mere currency of a statement lends credibility to it. People are ready to accept a statement that is commonly asserted by others. The familiar example of the use of repetition is commercial advertisement. There will be repetition of the brand name both in newspaper advertisements and in radio commercials. Exaggeration is another commonly used technique in commercial advertisement. It not only announces the product but also asserts that it is unrivaled, that it is used by millions, and so on. The same techniques are adopted by the political propagandist and the religious missionary. Identification. It is not possible for a stranger to persuade us except by an confidence trickster. We are easily impressed by those with whom we are familiar and with whom we are closely identified. There are several ways of achieving identification. The most obvious is to use the familiar expressions. Another way is to exhibit familiarity with the listener's or reader's environment. This makes the message not only familiar but also concrete. Another method is identification with the interests of the people to whom the message is directed. During the World War II, the German and Japanese radio broadcasts to India emphasized that they were out to protect Indian interests. It is a familiar fact that the politician, when he is in opposition, always has the interest of the poor and downtrodden as the dominant theme in his speeches. Appeal to authority. Illustrations can be given from commercial advertisement. The leading citizen's picture or the picture of the much admired film star is given along with the message that he or she uses the product. Similarly, the political propagandist uses the name of the national leaders to enhance his own prestige and credibility. Appeal to prevailing discontentment. Propaganda to succeed must take up the issues which are agitating the minds of the people in the group. This is how many agitations against the ruling party can make an impression when there is a price rise. Mere agitation for the sake of agitation can never catch the imagination of the public unless the agitation is linked up with some widespread dissatisfaction in the group like price rise and unemployment. The influence of slogans. Finally, attention may be drawn to the profound influence of slogans, the short, catchy phrases. During the American War of Independence, the French Revolution, the Indian War of Independence in 1857, slogans played a very significant role because people can understand them, they are moved by them. It is needless to draw attention to the great influence of the slogans like Quit India, Do or Die in 1942 or Garibi Hatao in 1970. Totalitarian indoctrination. One of the unique features of the totalitarian government's 20th century is the complete control over the means of communication and their use for vigorous indoctrination of the entire nation. The people do not have free press. They cannot hear alternative views and opinions. So, they cannot evaluate the information purveyed by the government. Khrushchev once said, "Writers are gunners in the struggle for the construction of a socialist society." The task of the newspapers is to tell people what they ought to know. That is, what will help them more effectively to serve the interests of the state. The function of the press is to promote the revolution. In China, the aim of the leaders now is to remold the thinking of the people to Marxism, Leninism, and the thought of Mao Zedong. Propaganda techniques and indoctrination are used to change people's ideas and ways of thinking. All opposition is silenced. There is indoctrination in schools and colleges. There is brainwashing of those sentenced to imprisonment, whether nationals or allies. It is a part of the overall program of thought reform. The aim of propaganda and indoctrination is efficient thought control. A public relations official in the industries, commerce, as well as in government is both a public opinion analyst and a propagandist. As a public opinion analyst, he or she studies the moods, the desires, and the probable reactions, the various publics which are important to his client organization. As a propagandist, he or she helps his client organization to sell a product, a point of view, an ideology, etc. He or she interprets their clients to the public. While the totalitarian governments indoctrinate, the public relations officials persuade because they operate in a democratic setting. They use all the mass media available for this purpose. It is called the engineering of consent. As Bernays puts it, the phrase engineering approach refers to action based on thorough knowledge of the situation and on the application of scientific principles and tried practices to the task of getting people to support ideas and programs. Any person or organization depends ultimately on public approval and is therefore forced with the problem of engineering the public's consent to a program or goal. According to him, the engineering of consent is the very essence of the democratic process, the freedom to persuade and suggest. Men of this profession are called information officers in the government. Universities in many countries, including India, have been giving courses in public relations and degrees are awarded. The main task of the man belonging to the profession of public relations is to build up the image of the company, the organization, or the government in the minds of the people. They are image makers. His task is to build up attitudes and standardize opinions on controversial issues to mold public sentiment regarding the organization. He uses the various mass media for this purpose. He plans in advance the campaign strategy, the basic appeals, the types of speeches, the radio and television programs. Conditions for propaganda success. Propaganda in favor of some social objective like non-discriminatory communal relations or positive attitudes toward organized labor can be effective only under certain conditions. According to the result of researches, at least one or more of the three conditions must be satisfied if the propaganda campaign is to be successful, namely monopolization, canalization, and supplementation. Monopolization of all mass media available is possible only under two conditions. In a totalitarian state where the government has the entire control over all the mass media, and in a democratic government during war or when the society is in a crisis. However, if there is a general discussion and if there is a possibility of counter propaganda, then the result will be neutralization. This is exactly what happens in political campaigning in a democratic country. Studies in voting behavior shows that the campaigns have no effect on the people. In a broad sense, there are three groups of people when there is full-scale campaigning going on: those in favor, those against, and those who are indifferent. Generally, it is the third group that is in the majority. Those in favor will read all the newspaper articles, attend the public meetings, etc., which reinforce their opinion, and similarly, those against will read only the other set of articles. Thus, propaganda will not bring about any change in those with firm convictions, nor does it bring about any large-scale dramatic changes in those who are uncommitted. In other words, the existence of controversy and the opportunities for free expression of respective views will not facilitate the success of propaganda. It will succeed only when there is monopolization and all dissent is cut out. Propaganda techniques cannot succeed when the aim of the propagandist is some change in basic values of the group. This is illustrated by the respective fates of the DK and DMK and now the ADMK parties in Tamil Nadu. The DK party seeks a radical change in the group. It wants the group to give up all the cherished values and religious sentiments and adopt hostile attitudes towards those in favor of these values and sentiments. The agitations launched by them have had only temporary and local successes. But the more liberal campaigns of the DMK party have had greater success. Thus, propaganda techniques can have success if they aim at merely canalization rather than elimination of or total change in the basic values of the group. A reference may be made in this connection to the techniques used by Mahatma Gandhi. Though he went against a number of so-called basic attitudes like untouchability, he reinforced the really basic values of the group like prayer, etc. Thus, propaganda techniques which aim at the canalization of the basic attitudes can succeed, not those which endeavor to change them completely. The third condition under which propaganda techniques may succeed effectively is when the mass propaganda is supplemented by face-to-face contacts. Mass media by themselves cannot sustain any mass movement. There must be widespread local organizations which get into touch with the local people and organize lectures, discussions, get togethers, etc. The Soviet Union in Russia, the Nazi Party in Germany, and Moisen in China had a network of local organizations which maintained face to face contacts with the people. The Soviet leaders had organized red corners, reading huts, and listening stations where groups of citizens were exposed to mass media in common and where the local ideological elite could get into touch with the rank and file and explain to them the contents of the newspaper articles and the communist constitution. Thus, propaganda and indoctrination programs can succeed only when local organizations promoting face to face contacts exist as adjuncts to the mass media. It may be pointed out that the existence of local organizations at the village and taluk levels is responsible for the success of the Indian National Congress right from 1920. The other parties have not been able to build up such local committees and leadership except the communist parties in limited areas. Persuasive communication. Persuasion is an important part in the daily life of every human being because every individual is highly dependent on others for securing the basic needs of life as well as for education, enlightenment, entertainment, etc. As human interaction increases, the necessity for persuasion also increases. One of the distinguishing features of persuasion is that it always involves communication. At the simplest level, a communication situation exists when one person transmits a message that is received by another individual and is acted upon by that individual. Thus, communication situation is a typical interaction situation. Thus, in persuasive communication, the aim of the source is to be deliberately produce a message designed to elicit some specific behavior in the receiver, whether it consists of an individual or a group. Consequently, persuasive communications can be judged in terms of their success or failure in producing the desired behavior in the receiver. The effect of persuasion is indeed difficult to judge. For example, the socialist parties in India have not succeeded in obtaining the return of many of their candidates in the state legislatures or in the central parliament. However, there is no doubt that they have largely influenced the policies and programs of the Congress party so that socialistic pattern of society became an accepted objective. Further, there is the problem of time. Though some persuasive communications may fail in their short-term effects, they may succeed in their long-term effects. For example, the adult literacy campaigns in India launched during the 30s have failed in the sense that the adult literacy rate was only about 16% in 1951. However, in terms of long-range results, the great desire for starting schools and colleges and even universities since 1950 may be attributed to the persuasive communication with respect to adult education, which has created an atmosphere in favor of education in general. It looks as if though the adults were not and even now are not keen on acquiring literacy themselves. They are eager that their children, particularly boys, should become literate and educated. This has led to the literacy rate going up to 74.04% today. Howland and Janis suggest that persuasive effects can be looked upon as bringing about attitude changes which may lead to opinion changes, perception changes, and affect changes. According to them, attitude change is the underlying variable. As regards the basic factors in persuasion, there are 4 factors which appear to be central to persuasive communication from the point of view of the receiver, namely variations in the source, in the message, in the channels used, and in the situation. As regards the source, the important factors are his or her credibility, social power, societal role, relationship to the receiver, and various demographic factors such as age, sex, and occupation. Regarding the message itself, it depends not only on the content of the message but also on the appeals used, the organization of the message, the nature of the arguments used, the language, the style, etc. With respect to the channel, it depends upon whether it is face-to-face situation or through the newspaper, the movie, the radio, or the television. There is also the problem of the same message being communicated in several channels. Finally, there is the problem of the situation, whether the persuasive communication is in the presence or the absence of others, whether it is communicated in familiar or unfamiliar surroundings, whether it is given at a pleasant moment or not, etc. Persuasion and propaganda. The term propaganda has a bad reputation since it is associated with the deliberate manipulation of public opinion to serve the interests of a small group. It is associated with the use of special techniques to increase the power of a small group over the majority. The term persuasion is associated with convincing the people of the desirability of certain beliefs, actions, etc. The moralist persuades people to overcome their egoism, selfishness, and personal cravings in interest of some supernatural order or of their own higher selves or of the society. However, there is no doubt that the two terms are used interchangeably. The aim of the social psychologist is to study the phenomenon, but there is always the fear that the scientific knowledge may be used by interested people to promote their anti-social interests, like, for example, Hitler and Goebbels, who used the various techniques to make the Germans strive to annihilate the Jews and bend their energies to become the masters of the world. Dear students, there is no doubt that propaganda or persuasive communication may be used to manipulate people. However, this is not due to the techniques themselves. It is rather due to lie ends to achieve which the techniques are used. There is an analogy here to the recent advances in knowledge in chemistry and atomic physics. Knowledge in chemistry has enabled the development of medicines to fight disease. It has also enabled unscrupulous governments to develop gases to kill the enemy civilians. The recent developments in Syria are an example of this. Similarly, the knowledge of atomic physics can be used to generate power for constructive civilian uses, as is being done in India in Kalpakam, Trombay, and Kundankulam, or to prepare atomic bombs, as in China, Russia, and United States. In the same way, the techniques of propaganda may be used for antisocial purposes or to enable to know the dangers of population explosion and change their attitudes in order to learn the techniques to control the birth rate and to accept the small family norm. Conclusion. Propaganda, be it true or be it false, always influences the people. The propagation of facts generally benefits the people, while on the other hand, the propagation of falsehood leads to unfounded rumors circulating in the people. All kinds of tensions are created, which sometimes result in open conflicts. The deceptive propaganda against the Jews in Nazi Germany led to the creation of so much hatred against this particular race that there was no protest against the terrible activities of the members of the Nazi leadership, which led to the massacre of so many millions of innocent Jews. This is one of the most striking and living examples of the bad consequences of deceptive propaganda. Similar instances of misleading propaganda occurred in the Middle Ages when many religious propagandists aroused hatred and animosity for other religions. The pages of history are strewn with the description of the activities of crusaders All these are living examples of the dangers of deceptive propaganda. Similarly, one nowadays so often comes across misleading propaganda in the field of international relations. The Chinese are continuing in their campaign of recrimination against India and are constantly saying that the Indians are the aggressors and the Chinese have birthright upon thousands of miles of Indian territory. In much the same vein, Pakistan is propagating the view that Kashmir should be handed over to her, as India has no right upon it. Even international peace is endangered by misleading propaganda of this kind because it leads to creation of animosity in the minds of the people and they unnecessarily foster feelings of fear and hatred which are very easily ignited and may burst at any moment into an all-consuming conflagration. To conclude, it may be said that if misleading and deceptive propaganda is to be counteracted, it is necessary to attack the problem from all angles. The public should be educated. The misleading propaganda should be exposed. The government should be sternly punish the miscreants. Propaganda contradicting it should be effected, and all circumstances, whether social or economic, should be eliminated from this society.
Thank you.